In the Victorian era, living conditions were cramped, dirty, and overcrowded for the working classes. If you could afford the expense, then you might share 1 or 2 rented rooms with your family of several people, and perhaps a few subtenants as well. But if you were really poor, then your bed was to be found in the workhouse casual ward, the cold, hard streets. Or if you could scrape together a few pennies, you could pay for a night in a common lodging house. This was a house, or part of a house, where you could stay in 1 or more rooms in complete lack of privacy, with a mass of strangers, people who were not members of your family, whether for eating or sleeping. Perhaps the closest modern equivalent is a hostel. After what you will hear today, you might not be surprised that some might have saved their pennies for bread and a park bench, rather than a bed in one of these dreaded Victorian doss houses. These were places where you would find yourself sleeping with everybody and anybody, thieves, prostitutes, vagabonds, and the sick, even rats. And the bed, well, that might still be warm from the previous occupier, for people often slept in a 2 or even 3 relay system 24 hours a day. So you might expect the sheets to have been changed regularly. Think again, for the sheets might see more people in a week than you would. If you had any valuables, you minded them well, for in the morning you'd have them no more, and that included your boots and clothes. But in any event, you probably wouldn't leave empty-handed, for it was quite likely that you would have been gifted those same coughs and splutters from your fellow inmate that prevented you from sleeping all night. But if you were a low-paid labourer that couldn't afford to rent your own room, it was cheap, dirt cheap. And look on the plus side, at least it wasn't the workhouse, and in the winter you wouldn't freeze to death. Most common lodging houses were to be found in working-class districts, many in East London, often characterising whole streets. Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields were full of them, and the nefarious activities of their owners and inmates were well known. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, victims of Jack the Ripper, lived in common lodging houses in Flower and Dean Street. Some had better reputations than others, but most of them in the slums were magnets for social degradation, the haunts of vice and crime. Today, you will hear a genuine account of a stay in one of London's common lodging houses told by Jack London, an American journalist and social activist. He travelled through the East End at the turn of the 20th century, disguised in a working man's clothes so he could experience the struggles of everyday people for himself. You will discover what it was like to stay in a large municipal lodging house, the lack of privacy and prison-like conditions for its miserable inmates, and, not least, the intolerable stench and noise. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. While 300,000 people of London live in one-room tenements and 900,000 are illegally and viciously housed, 38,000 more are registered as living in common lodging houses, known in the vernacular as doss houses. There are many kinds of doss houses, but in one thing they are all alike. From the filthy little ones to the monster big ones, paying 5% and blatantly loaded by smug middle-class men who know nothing about them. And that one thing is their uninhabitableness. By this I do not mean that the roofs leak or the walls are drafty, but what I do mean is that life in them is degrading and unwholesome. The poor man's hotel, they are often called, but the phrase is caricature. Not to possess a room to oneself, in which sometimes to sit alone, to be forced out of bed willy-nilly the first thing in the morning, to engage and pay anew for a bed each night, and never to have any privacy, surely is a mode of existence quite different from that of hotel life. This must not be considered a sweeping condemnation of the big private and municipal lodging houses and working men's homes. Far from it. They have remedied many of the atrocities attendant upon the irresponsible small doss houses, and they give the workman more for his pay than he ever received before, but that does not make them as habitable or wholesome as the dwelling place of a man should be who does his work in the world. The little private doss houses, as a rule, are unmitigated horrors, I have slept in them, and I know, but let me pass them by and confine myself to the bigger and better ones. Not far from Middlesex Street, Whitechapel, I entered such a house, a place inhabited almost entirely by working men. The entrance was by way of a flight of steps descending from the sidewalk to what was properly the cellar of the building. Here were 2 large and gloomily lighted rooms, in which men cooked and ate. I had intended to do some cooking myself, but the smell of the place stole away my appetite, or rather wrested it from me, so I contented myself with watching other men cook and eat. One workman, home from work, sat down opposite me at the rough wooden table and began his meal. A handful of salt on the not-over-clean table constituted his butter. Into it he dipped his bread, mouthful by mouthful, and washed it down with tea from a big mug. A piece of fish completed his bill of fare. He ate silently, looking neither to right nor left, nor across at me. Here and there, at the various tables, other men were eating, just as silently. In the whole room there was hardly a note of conversation. A feeling of gloom pervaded the ill-lighted place. Many of them sat and brooded over the crumbs of their repast, and it made me wonder, as Childe Roland wondered, a 19th-century fairy tale where children disappear into darkness, what evil they had done that they should be punished so. From the kitchen came the sounds of more genial life, and I ventured into the range where the men were cooking. But the smell I had noticed on entering was stronger here, and a rising nausea drove me into the street for fresh air. On my return I paid 5p for a cabin, took my receipt for the same in the form of a huge brass cheque, and went upstairs to the smoking room. Here a couple of small billiard tables and several checkerboards were being used by young working men who waited in relays for their turn at the games, while many men were sitting round, smoking, reading, and mending their clothes. The young men were hilarious. The old men were gloomy. In fact, there were 2 types of men, the cheerful and the sodden, or blue, and age seemed to determine the classification. But no more than the 2 cellar rooms did this room convey the remotest suggestion of home. Certainly there could be nothing home-like about it to you and me, who know what home really is. On the walls were the most preposterous and insulting notices, regulating the conduct of the guests, and at 10 o'clock the lights were put out, and nothing remained but bed. This was gained by descending again to the cellar, by surrendering the brass cheque to a burly doorkeeper, and by climbing a long flight of stairs into the upper regions. I went to the top of the building and down again, passing several floors filled with sleeping men. The cabins were the best accommodation, each cabin allowing space for a tiny bed and room alongside of it in which to undress. The bedding was clean, and with neither it nor the bed do I find any fault, but there was no privacy about it, no being alone. To get an adequate idea of a floor filled with cabins, you have merely to magnify a layer of the pasteboard pigeonholes of an egg crate, till each pigeonhole is 7 feet in height and otherwise properly dimensioned. Then place the magnified layer on the floor of a large, barn-like room, and there you have it. There are no ceilings to the pigeonholes. The walls are thin, and the snores from all the sleepers and every move and turn of your nearer neighbours come plainly to your ears. And this cabin is yours only for a little while. In the morning, out you go. You cannot put your trunk in it, or come and go when you like, or lock the door behind you, or anything of that sort. In fact, there is no door at all, only a doorway. If you care to remain a guest in this poor man's hotel, you must put up with all this, and with prison regulations which impress upon you constantly that you are nobody, with little soul of your own and less to say about it. Now, I contend that the least a man who does his day's work should have is a room to himself, where he can lock the door and be safe in his possessions, where he can sit down and read by a window or look out, where he can come and go whenever he wishes, where he can accumulate a few personal belongings other than those he carries about with him on his back and in his pockets, where he can hang up pictures of his mother, sister, sweetheart, ballet dancers, or bulldogs, as his heart listeth. In short, one place of his own on the earth, of which he can say, "This is mine, my castle, the world stops at the threshold, here I am lord and master." He will be a better citizen, this man, and he will do a better day's work. I stood on one floor of the poor man's hotel and listened. I went from bed to bed and looked at the sleepers. They were young men, from 20 to 40, most of them. Old men cannot afford the working man's home. They go to the workhouse. But I looked at the young men. Scores of them. And they were not bad-looking fellows. Their faces were made for women's kisses, their necks for women's arms. They were lovable, as men are lovable. They were capable of love. A woman's touch redeems and softens. And they needed such redemption and softening, instead of each day growing harsh and harsher. And I wondered where these women were, and heard a harlot's ginny laugh. Leman Street, Waterloo Road, Piccadilly, the Strand answered me, and I knew where they were.